Hi everyone, welcome back. This is the second session in our discussion on Enochic literature. In our first session, we talked about the history of the tradition, the theology of the tradition, the historical development of it, and also its application in Second Temple Judaism. And in this session, I want to dive into the text itself. I'm going to look at what is the book of First Enoch, the related traditions to it, and also sort of a brief commentary as we run through it as well. So we'll start by just looking at the structure of the book as a whole. So here I'm using Van de Kam and Nickelsburg's translation in the Hermenia collection, and they identify 5 major sections in the book itself, which are followed by 2 short appendices. Now the first 5 sections are the Book of Watches, the Book of Parables, the Book of Luminaries, the Book of Dream Visions, and the Epistles of Enoch. And those are, if you remember from our first session, sort of what's been identified by scholars as the Enochic Pentateuch, the 5 books of Enoch. And then we see that the second section of the book, the 2 short appendices, are sort of added on much later. That's the birth of Noah, which is an interesting midrashic story detailing the birth of Noah and also his connection with the flood, but also for the post-flood priesthood. And then we also have the final book of Enoch, which is just sort of a rehashing of a lot of the material in the book of Parables and the Epistles of Enoch, but sort of just written much later and sort of tacked onto the end of the book. When it comes to the age and the dating of these texts, we see that the earliest of these sections, which is identified as the Book of Watches and the Book of Luminaries, which is also sometimes called the Astronomical Book, are sort of identified as the oldest. And this is because, well, the manuscripts themselves, J.T. Mealick identified them as being pre or exilic texts, so written sort of around 5 to 300 BC, so very old compared to the rest of this contemporary literature, which is sort of understood to be written in the Second Temple period, sort of 50 to 30 BC, even as early as 30 AD. But it's also because the older sections of the Book of Watches and the Astronomical Book seem to go back even further to sort of earlier Mesopotamian literature. And we talked a little bit about that in our first session. We looked at sort of what Kvanvig and Forsyth will say, detailing the age of these things. But these are sort of what we would call the closest thing to what we could call an antediluvian tradition, in that they're even identified in much older cultures which retain similar stories. But when it comes to the authorship of the book itself, it's important to recognize that these 5 books themselves were sort of later editions, and the text itself was developed over a period. And so in that case, we probably won't say necessarily that Enoch wrote all of it. So Van de Kam will sort of say that the subsequent sections of the Enochic tradition are representing developing stages in the Enochic tradition. So each later book sort of builds on the earlier ones. And so the authority in all of them is that they're tied together to the earliest revelation of Enoch, such as the one that we see in the Book of Watches, which seems to be referred to in the Mosaic material of Genesis 5 and also Genesis 6. But the authority of the text itself doesn't really rest on the idea that Enoch himself wrote it. And as we've pointed, that would kind of be a bit of a naive claim because a lot of the later sections of the book are clearly exilic or post-exilic, especially in the details and the purpose for writing such a text. But that doesn't mean to say that it's inauthentic or that it's fake or that it has no connection with the patriarch Enoch. It's a similar thing to what I would say we have with Ecclesiastes and Song of Songs. So most scholars would, I think, correctly state that Ecclesiastes and Song of Songs was probably not written by Solomon himself, but that doesn't stop them being recognized as authoritative works that represent the thought of Solomon. And this is because they take their place in what's called the Solomonic tradition. And so the later authors that added to these books were faithfully representing the Solomonic school and its thought. And I think the same thing can be said here for First Enoch. The fact that the text was developed over long periods of time doesn't make it inauthentic in its relation to a early book or text that was revealed possibly to Enoch, possibly continued through Noah, then passed down to figures like Abraham and Noah. And so Mead, I think, correctly concludes here. He says attribution in First Enoch, so attribution meaning authorship or who wrote it, is primarily a claim to authoritative tradition and not a statement of literary origins. So to sum what we're saying here and to conclude, the authoritative formula for the Enochic corpus, and especially its authority within Enochic Judaism, wasn't necessarily to say that Enoch wrote all of it. but it was more to say that the tradition represented the thoughts, the words, and the prophecies that had been passed down since Enoch, and they were developed, reinterpreted, and reapplied in certain different contexts. So that's, I think, a helpful introduction to the text of First Enoch itself. I think it gets us off on the right track. So what we'll do from here is we'll actually dive into the text itself. So we'll start with the Book of Watchers, which is sort of the first 36 chapters of the book, and as I mentioned before, it's most likely one of the oldest sections of the book. But we're going to start with looking at the first 5 chapters in this video. We'll leave the story of the fallen watchers and the sin of the angels and the giants for a later video after this one. But I think it's helpful to start with just the first 5 chapters, as this introduces us to the text, introduces us to the purpose of the text. And so will see that the structure of it is sort of just fourfold. It's quite straightforward. It's only 5 chapters, and each chapter is sort of short in and of itself. So we start with 1 Enoch 1-3, which is the superscription, and this introduces us to the author of the book, Enoch, introduces us to his purpose and his thought in writing it, and after that the author launches into what we've called the theophany here, the theophany being a revelation of God, an appearance of God. And then after the theophany in chapters 2-5 is sort of the indictment on the wicked, and this is sort of an extensive sort of wisdom literature, sermon, prophetic utterance proclaiming the judgment that God is going to bring in his theophanic appearance. And then finally the verdict, sort of a final word of judgment and a final word of blessing as well for the righteous, and of course judgment for the wicked. And so Nickelsberger, I just want to start with his sort of understanding of how this sort of first 5 chapters is framed. He says it's a later addition to the text, which most likely paraphrases a lot of biblical prophetic tradition. And so when we say late addition to the text, we're not saying that this was completely made up on the spot. What we're more saying is that when the text was compiled in the way that it appears before us now, these were added at the start because they were felt to be the best way to introduce the later texts like the Book of Watchers and also especially the astronomical book. And so it's a late addition in the position that it's in, and it definitely seems to most likely have been possibly compiled and written probably a little bit after the Book of Watchers itself. But at the same time, it's not just to say that it was just tacked on willy-nilly or ad hoc. This text has very clear ties thematically and theologically with the Book of Watchers. And so it's kind of at this point hard to actually separate them. They do go together in a very intrinsic way. But Nickelsberg is simply pointing out that this was most likely put in the position it is in a later date. He says the opening verses, that's 1-2, are actually a paraphrase of things like Deuteronomy 33:1 and Numbers 24:3-4, and that's a similar thing. Deuteronomy 33:1 is, this is the words of which Moses blessed the children of Israel, similar to these are the words by which Enoch blessed the chosen generation. You see a similar thing in Numbers 24. And the reason that the author is doing this is setting himself in a long line of prophets and cites certain heavenly visions and auditions as the authority of the revelation. So Enoch's revelation is being put alongside that of Moses and also later prophets in the biblical tradition. Moving on to the passages of 1-4-9 and then also 5-4-9. These are sort of lengthy oracles which sort of follow a later prophetic style that announce sort of the imminent judgment of God. And the first half is reminiscent of biblical theophonic texts like Deuteronomy 33, Micah 1, Zechariah 14:5. And the later half, 5-4-9, draws to some extent on the imagery and language of later prophetic traditions like Isaiah 65, which talk about sort of very clear eschatological themes. And then the prose section in the middle, which is 1 Enoch 2:1-5:3, is this long sort of wisdom poem contrasting the obedience of nature with the rebellion of humanity. That's sort of a brief 1,000-feet view of what we're going to look at. So we'll dive into it now. So we start with 1 Enoch 1:1-3. I'll read this whole section. The words of the blessing with which Enoch blessed the righteous chosen, who will be present on the day of tribulation to remove all the enemies. The righteous will be saved. He took up his discourse and said, Enoch, a righteous man whose eyes were opened by God, who had the vision of the Holy One and of heaven, which he showed me. From the words of the watchers and the holy ones I heard everything, and as I heard everything from them, I also understood what I saw. Not for this generation do I expound, but concerning one that is distant I speak, and concerning the chosen I speak now. concerning them I take up my discourse. So Enoch here is, like we talked about in our last session, Milik will describe him as the antediluvian sage par excellence. And so the Enoch tradition begins and is actually built on the claim that these words are those of the antediluvian patriarch Enoch. And Enoch is then put as sort of the prototypical prophet, alongside figures like Moses and Daniel, who bring forward the sort of, the law of the Lord, or the eschatological vision of God and his plan in history. But so Enoch is sort of the prototypical prophet par excellence, but he's also a diviner, and he sort of reveals this revelation of God, what's framed as a new revelation of God. But it's interesting that in this framework, the revelation brought forth by Enoch is a new one in the sense that it's never been read before, it's been published here for the first time, but it was revealed a long time ago. So it's sort of old but new. It's old, but it was hidden, and so now it's being revealed, and so it's new. And this is sort of this idea of Enoch being a prophet and being a sage is something that many later biblical traditions attest to. So we start obviously in Genesis 5, which is sort of the only mention of Enoch in the Bible, aside from later reflections on this in Chronicles and then obviously in Hebrews and Jude. But it just says that Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. And that's been translated in many different ways, interpreted in many different ways. But the most straightforward reading is that Enoch had a special relationship with God, and that was something that sort of saved him from death. He was taken by God. And Hebrews 11 will reflect on this more, and it will highlight specifically Enoch's faith, which is what led him to not experience death because God took him away. And so the special relationship between Enoch and God is highlighted in these passages. But then when we get to the New Testament, at the end of the New Testament rather, the book of Jude, Enoch is specifically identified as a prophet. We read in Jude 1:14-15 that Enoch, the seventh from Adam, prophesied about the people of the end times, which Jude viewed as the current opponents to the church. And he quotes here from the theophanic passage. So I won't read all of that because we'll read that in the next section. But Jude here quotes from First Enoch as a prophetic tradition. And this is in our Bible. So this is very, very fascinating. Very fascinating detail there. Probably best left for a full teaching on the book of Jude, which possibly we could do in the future. But when we turn to the Second Temple literature, we actually see a more specifically Enoch identified as this sort of source of wisdom and a sage. So there's an extensive passage in Jubilees 4:17-19, which says that Enoch was the first of humanity who was born on the earth and learned the art of writing, instruction, and wisdom, and he wrote down the signs of the sky in accord with the fixed patterns of the months. So this is Enoch sort of having all knowledge of creation. He was the first of humanity to invent writing and instruction and wisdom, and he used that to map the stars and to invent astronomy. He was also the first to write a testimony, and here the testimony is probably understood as a testimony of sort of prophetic things to happen, but also most likely of judgment. He taught them the weeks of the Jubilees, the days of the years, the months, the related Sabbaths, etc. So this is a liturgical function. Enoch has a priestly liturgical function in his wisdom. And then finally, he's sort of this amazing prophet, this one who, while he slept, saw a vision of what was to happen and what will occur from the beginning of humanity to the day of judgment. So Enoch has this sprawling prophetic vision of the entire history of humanity, the entire plan of God and salvation, and he saw everything and understood. And that's a very bold claim. And then he wrote that testimony and placed it on the earth for humanity for their history. So he is like the prophet, capital P prophet, double underline, the one who understood all things and saw all things, and sort of the one from which all later prophets sort of draw their tradition from. And then when we see in other Second Temple literature, like the Wisdom of Ben Sira, there's sort of a further take on Genesis 5, where we see that Enoch walked with God and was taken, but here the author draws special attention to the fact that Enoch was a miracle of knowledge to all generations. I've just got a note here from Charles in his Apocrypha of the Old Testament. He talks about how there's a Greek sort of variant here that talks about Enoch being a miracle of metanoia, so sort of a miracle of repentance, I believe, for all generations. But Charles points out that the original Hebrew most likely is best understood as meaning a miracle of knowledge. So later, sort of the Greek version shows Enoch as a miracle of faith, as a miracle of repentance, as a miracle of faith to God's people. But in the original text, it's most likely the case that it was this primitive feature of the Enochic tradition, is that Enoch had special wisdom and knowledge. And then he will say at the end in Sirach 49 that no one has been created on earth like Enoch, who was taken from the earth. So Enoch is special among all humanity. No one was like him. He's more special than Adam or Moses or Abraham. It's a very specific place there among the Old Testament prophets. The Wisdom of Solomon says that he was pleasing to God, and that's actually a specific interpretation of Genesis 5, where instead of reading walked with God, the LXX has Enoch was pleasing to God. And so that's why we get this idea that to walk with God means to be pleasing in God's sight. And you see that in Genesis, you see that in Deuteronomy as well. Walk before me, be blameless. When God says that to Abraham, is referring to be pleasing to me, walk in my statutes. And so Enoch is said to be the first to do this, even though he lived in a time of sinners. But he was transferred, he was taken from that, and he was taken so that evil would not change his understanding, or treachery deceive his soul. And understanding here is the same word, this idea of gnosis, this idea of wisdom, of knowledge. Enoch here had special knowledge, and he was taken away from the earth so that the evil teachings of the earth would not affect his heavenly knowledge. But these ideas of Enoch as a sage and as a wisdom figure are actually probably also older than the biblical text. And so it's not just to say that this is an invention of the biblical tradition, but these ideas are much older. And they're actually found in earlier Mesopotamian literature, which most likely retained the earliest memories of the patriarch Enoch. And that shows a link between Enoch and the propagation of divine wisdom before the flood. And it suggests that the legends of the divine sage and the visionary are firmly cemented in a cultural imagination, but also probably a historical memory of humanity that points towards the early Enoch literature. The main connection is between the seventh antediluvian patriarch Enoch and the seventh antediluvian king of Sippar, Edmendurenki, in the Sumerian king lists. And I'll do a brief comparison of that now. See that Edmendurenki is the seventh king who ruled in the ancient city of Sippar, whose patron deity was Shamash, the sun deity. And in the Mesopotamian literature, he's identified as a sage and a diviner who walked with the gods and learned their secrets, but he was taken up to live with them before he died on earth. And W.G. Lambert, in his translation, he reads the Nineveh text as this: They honored him, they set him on a large throne of gold, they gave him the tablet of the gods, the secret of heaven and the underworld. He is the learned sage who guards the secrets of the great gods. When you compare Enoch to this, there's a lot of similarities. So Enoch is the seventh from Adam, just as Edmendurenki was the seventh antediluvian king. And he is said to walk with God and no more, and be no more, because he was taken up, in the same way that Edmendurenki walked with the gods. And then later, Enochic traditions place Enoch as having learned special knowledge from God as related to his special relationship with God. And then also the phrase walked with denotes this special relationship, which we've talked about, but also a sort of a priestly function. But then a final detail of similarity, which is interesting. Recall that Edmendurenki is the sort of the patron of the sun deity, Shamash. Interestingly, Enoch lives a total of 365 years, which is incredibly short in the list and incredibly specific as well. This is the length of a solar year. And the reason this is interesting and worth pointing out is that at the time, Israelite audiences and Israelite authors did not use a solar calendar, they used a lunar calendar. And so for the author to specifically here mention a solar calendar is really interesting. It's a sort of glowing neon sign to point to these older traditions, these older connections in the text. There's also the detail of the idea of dreams and the sun god, and how that connects with Enoch living the totality of a solar year, which is interesting. So in the Mesopotamian mythology, the god of dreams Zikiku is considered as the son of Shamash, and his corresponding female deity Mamu is the daughter of Shamash. And so Van de Kam and his Enoch and the growth of an apocalyptic tradition will note that the dream deities belong to the family of Shamash, and so there's this connection with solar deities, the solar year, and visionary experiences. And so Enoch's connection with the solar year, and then his subsequent connection with prophetic dreams and visions, sort of further strengthens these similarities. And this is so much so that some scholars would say that Enoch is modeled off Edmendurenki, who is the founder of the Baru, or the diviners, and the Omen interpreters. And I understand where Collins is coming from when he says this, but I personally would say the other way around. I think that the figure Enoch is much older, as we would say pre-flood. And that the cultural memory of this sage figure, one who walked with God and was taken by the God and sort of lives in heaven, is sort of retained in these Mesopotamian traditions. So I disagree. I don't think it's Enoch is modeled off Edmund Renki. I think it's Edmund Renki is modeled off Enoch. But the reason I go into this detail is just to show you the old connections here that we have. This story is very old and most likely goes back to a pre-flood era. I also want to talk about this idea of Enoch being with the angels, this midrashic element that we see in the book of Enoch, and how him walking with God could also, in the Second Temple literature, be understood as him walking with the angels. So in Genesis 5:24, in English it reads quite simplistically that Enoch walked with God, capital G God, and that he was no more because God took him. And so in both these senses, Yahweh is meant to be understood as the object, or the subject of the word here. But there's a key difference in the way that the Hebrew is written in each case, and this sort of points out the logic of this interpretation. In the first sense, Enoch walked with God. There is actually there is a definite article, there is a definite article here. And in Hebrew, if you are using a definite article, you're not using it as a proper name or a title. You're referring to a group of entities, especially if it's here in the plural. And so, like, Ha-Nevi'im is the prophets, Ha-Elohim is the gods or the divine beings. And so the interpretation here, at least some people suggest, that we could translate this as he walked with the Elohim, as in the angelic, the heavenly beings. And then after that, he was taken by Elohim singular, no definite article, as in God, capital G God, Yahweh. He was later taken by Yahweh after this sojourn with the heavenly beings. And so Enoch is portrayed as walking with the spiritual beings during his time on earth and is then taken by Yahweh to be in paradise. And you can see this in later Enochic tradition as well. So Jubilees 4:21-22 says that he was with the angels who showed him everything on earth and in the heavens. He wrote down everything. Moreover, he testified to the watchers who had sinned with the daughters of men and had become defiled. Then the Legend of the Jews, which is a much later compilation of these things, will say that while all the abominations defiled the earth, the pious Enoch sort of separated himself. No one knew where he was, and he was sojourning with the angels and the watchers and the holy ones who would come to him and give him special wisdom. And then after this, in Jubilees 4, it says that he was taken by God from human society to dwell in the Garden of Eden for his honor. And the Garden of Eden here is understood as a sort of temple space, this prototype temple, the holy place of God in the heavens. And so he is taken, because of his sojourning with the angels, to go and live with the angels permanently. And there he burns the incense of the sanctuary, which is sort of a priestly function. So Enoch here is sort of transitioned from the sage who sojourned with the angels and learned their wisdom into then being the heavenly priest in the heavenly tabernacle. So there's an interesting sort of development there. So all of this family places Enoch alongside the legends of antediluvian sages and wisdom, and this goes back to traditions all the way before the flood. And so even though the text in First Enoch here that we've been reading is much later, it's deeply rooted in this tradition and is most likely recalling a lot of it for its core theology. So the fact that Enoch escaped death and dwells in heaven places him in this high position within the prophetic tradition, and that's a place that no one else has occupied other than the prophet Elijah. And even though you see in Second Temple literature figures like Abraham and Moses being identified as taken to heaven after they die, they still experience bodily death, and so Enoch and Elijah don't, and so they're very special and specific. And so the text of 1 Enoch then, in light of all of this, it's claiming to bring to light this ancient wisdom and these ancient visions and applying them to the author's current era. And it's using the mouthpiece of the prophet Enoch to do that. And it's interesting that the way the prophet does this is to cement Enoch alongside the other prophetic voices of his day, or the other prophetic voices of the Israelite tradition. And you can see this in the theophany in 1 Enoch 1:3-9. So we'll move into that now. I've got a paraphrase of it here, and I won't read the whole thing, but I've paraphrased it on the side to the left. And on the right, you'll actually see the passages that these are referring to, the passages that recall the Old Testament passages. So I'll read from my paraphrased version. The great Holy One will come forth from his dwelling. The eternal God will tread on the earth upon Mount Sinai. He will appear with his angelic host, and the ends of the earth, and singing from the ends of the earth. So people will praise him from the ends of the earth at his coming. But then at the same time, the hills and the mountains and the wax will melt before him in his judgment, and he will pronounce judgment on all, as he comes with myriads of his holy ones to judge all flesh. So this is this sort of theophonic transferal of the coming of the Lord, but also the judgment of the Lord. And you can see all of these passages, predominantly in Deuteronomy 33 and in Micah 1 and in Jeremiah 25, that sort of point to this prophetic identification with what Enoch is saying here. So I'll just walk through it with a couple of notes from Nicolsburg and his commentary on 1st Enoch. Nicolsburg says that this section indicates an elaborate repetition of prophetic motifs and employs traditional language and imagery also found in several biblical theophonic texts like Deuteronomy 33, Jeremiah 25, and Micah 1, which we saw in my diagram before. And that diagram, by the way, is borrowed from Nicolsburg and his commentary. Nicolsburg notes that the present form and variety of the text suggests, interestingly, an unconscious combination, not an explicitly selective citation. What he means by that is that the author of 1st Enoch here is so ingrained in Israel's prophetic tradition, so ingrained in Israel's scriptures, that of course this is how Yahweh appears in a theophonic appearance. There is no other way to imagine Yahweh coming in judgment, because this is how the prophets have always spoken about him. And so what he's doing, it's no surprise that Enoch would have the same vision. Enoch is sort of setting forward in this logic the theophonic appearances that the prophets will have later on, because remember, Enoch is sort of the epitome of the prophets. He's the first prophet. And so Enoch beholds the divine glory before any other prophet will, and then every other prophet will experience it in the same way that Enoch did. And so there's, it's an unconscious combination. It's not explicitly selected in this way. The author just thinks about God in this way, and so it's of course it's how they talk about God appearing. That being said, though, the passage is also dependent, probably most specifically, on Deuteronomy 33, because this is a description of the Sinai theophany, which is sort of the basis for all of God's theophanies, because that's where he appears to bring his law on Israel. But here in 1st Enoch, it's projected into the future as the coming of his judgment, which you'll see in books like Micah and Jeremiah as well. And this is actually a very common motif in Second Temple literature as well. Nicolsburg makes a specific mention of the testament of Moses, which reads, "The heavenly one will arise from his kingly throne, yea, he will go forth from his holy habitation, with anger and wrath on behalf of his sons." And that's sort of very similar to what we read in 1st Enoch here. And Nicolsburg also comments that this is similar to Balaam's oracle over Israel in Numbers 24. So we move then from the theophany into the indictment, which is this wisdom-like poetry about how humanity is to contemplate the works of creation and compare that to their own sinfulness. So I'll just read a couple of segments here in 1st Enoch 2 to 5. We read, "Contemplate all his works and observe the works of heaven, how they do not alter their paths, and the luminaries of heaven, that they rise and set, each one ordered in its appointed time, and they appear on their feasts and do not transgress their appointed order. Observe the earth and contemplate the works that take place on it from the beginning until the consummation, that nothing on earth changes, all the works of God are manifest to you. Observe the signs of summer and winter, contemplate the signs of winter, that all the earth is filled with water and clouds, and dew and rain rest upon it. Observe how in like manner the sea and the rivers carry out and do not alter their works from his words." So here all creation is said to be incredibly orderly. It obeys God on every element. But then the author shifts and talks about the wicked. It says, "You have not stood firm, nor acted according to his commandments. You have turned aside, you have spoken proud and hard words with your unclean mouth against his majesty. Heart of heart, there will be no peace for you." And the subjects of this are both human, but also most likely also the Watchers themselves. And this is what connects this first 5 chapters to the Book of Watchers proper. Because, of course, when we get to the Book of Watchers, we'll see that it's the Watchers themselves who astray from God's set order to sleep with women on earth. And so the idea of everything doesn't go astray from its created order, but you did, applies both to human sin, but also to angelic sin, which is interesting. So there's sort of a shift in the text, as we can see, from this theophonic appearance to this sort of pronouncement of judgment from God. And it's sort of this central role of this idea of disobeying the divine order, the created order, that plays a central role in the Enochic tradition through the rest of its theology. Nickelsburg says that in this section the author addresses the sinners whose condemnation in the coming judgment has already been announced in the theophany, which we saw at the end. But he says here their sin is juxtaposed against all the works that are done on the earth and in heaven, and by the obedience of God's non-human creations. And so the elements of the created order then are sort of this foil for the wicked. Their orderly obedience to God judges the disobedience of the sinners. Nickelsburg says that the sinners are invited to observe and contemplate this unchanging faithful obedience to God's commands, which stands in stark contrast to the sinner's transgression of God's commandments. And he then also goes on to say how this fits in with the theophany itself. He will identify how there's sort of this chiastic movement from the blessing of the righteous at the end of the theophany to the judgment of the wicked at the end of the indictment. And he sort of identifies it this way. Verse 8 of chapter 1, we have the blessing of the righteous, but then in verse 9, we have the sin and the judgment pronounced on them. This then leads the author in the start of chapter 2 to do the whole contemplate the works, the wisdom poem, and that will then follow for the rest of chapter 2, 3, and 4, and the start of chapter 5. Chapter 5 repeats this, complete all these works, sort of doing a bookend on this section. And then the sin and the consequences of the judgment are referred to in 5 verse 4, and then in a complete inversion of the blessing pronounced at the start in chapter 1 verse 8, there is now curse in chapter 5 verses 5 to 6. And so there's this poetic inversion that goes on, and that can be displayed in the chiastic structure of the section, which I think is a really helpful way to understand how this is all working together. Nickelsburg also identifies that this theme of obedience in nature and disobedience in humanity is a common theme in both biblical and extra-biblical literature. So Jeremiah 5:23 to 24 says that the people of God are stubborn and rebellious of heart. They've turned aside and gone their own way. They do not say in their hearts, let us fear and please Yahweh our God, the one who gives the autumn rain and the spring and sets the times of harvest, and he keeps them for us. The logic here is creation obeys God. The spring rain obeys God. The seasons obey God, which we benefit from. But we don't want to obey God. And so there you can see the similar tendency. Creation's obedience and humanity's disobedience are juxtaposed. More specifically, though, you see in the Wisdom of Ben Sira this idea of juxtaposing nature and humanity. He says, I will reveal instruction with weight, and I announce understanding with precision. The judgment of the Lord has been in his works from the beginning, and from their creation he determined their divisions. He arranged his works for eternity, and their rulership for generations. And they do not hunger or grow weary. They do not forsake their works. Each one did not oppress his neighbor, and until eternity they will not disobey his word. So again, this idea of the obedience of nature. They do not disobey his word. They keep the Lord's statutes, but that's juxtaposed against humanity who do not. The Psalm of Solomon 18 is probably, I think, the best example of this. It reads in verse 11, Great and glorious is our God who dwells in the highest places, who appointed the stars in their courses for occasions of times and from day to day. But they do not transgress from the way that he commanded them. So the heavenly orders, the hosts, obey God. In the fear of the Lord is their path, and from the day God created them to eternity. So their order is actually their courses in the heavens is edged on by their obedience to God. They were not led astray from the day he created them. They were not removed from their ways from ancient times, unless God commanded them by the command of his servants. And there I'm thinking is most likely referring to passages like where Joshua tells the sun and the stars to stand still, and stuff like that. So that they only obey or disobey God when God, through his prophets or his servants, commands them to do so. So still, their straying is still classed as obedience. Yeah. And this informs the logic behind other Second Temple texts like Testament of Naphtali, who will explicitly connect the order and the obedience of the created order and the disobedience of the Gentiles, but also specifically the sons of God, which is important for the logic of the Book of Watchers itself. So Testament of Naphtali 3 and 2, and then sections all the way through to chapter 4, verse 1, we read, Sun, moon, and stars do not change their order. Thus also do you not change the law of God in the disorder of your deeds. The Gentiles who went astray and forsook the Lord changed their orders. They followed after stones and rocks and led astray by spirits of error. But you, my children, do not be like them, since you recognize the Lord in the firmament, on earth and in the sea, and in all created things that the Lord has made. Therefore do not be like Sodom, which changed the order of its nature. Likewise also the watchers changed the order of their nature, for I have read it in the sacred writings of Enoch. And so there, fascinatingly enough, the Testament of Tally directly references this section of the Book of Watchers as the sacred writings of Enoch. With all that said, we come to the end then of 1st Enoch 5, which is the verdict placed on both the righteous and the unrighteous. And here I've just got a small snippet of it. It's actually 9 whole verses long, but instead of reading through all of it, I just thought I'd read the general central section, which sort of conveys most of the meaning. It reads, "You will curse your days, and the years of your life will perish. The years of your destruction will increase in an eternal curse, and then you will leave your names as an eternal curse for all the righteous. And by you all who curse will curse, and all the sinners and wicked will swear by you." So that's sort of the judgment pronounced on the wicked. Sort of a similar riffing off here of Abraham's, "Those who bless you I will bless, and those who curse you I will curse." Sort of this repetition of the word curse all the way throughout it. Then we turn to the sort of the blessing on the righteous. It says, "But all the chosen will rejoice. For them there will be forgiveness of sins and mercy and peace and clemency. For them there will be salvation, a good light, and they will inherit the earth. But for your sinners there will be no salvation, and all of you a curse will abide." And so 1 Enoch 1 to 5 ends with this verdict announced upon both the righteous and the wicked. And the great judgment, which was alluded to in the theophany, especially in verses 6 and 9, is now brought to the forefront of the prophetic introduction of the book and sort of frames the rest of the logic of the text as we'll go forward. And as we saw in the theophany, Nickelsburg will also say that the author is following the pattern of Deuteronomy, establishing the sort of alternating pattern between blessing and curse. And Nickelberg notes how much of the material here is reminiscent of that which was used in theophany. So the theophany is really connected to the verdict itself. They're sort of two sides of the one coin. As well as this, though, Nickelsburg will note that the allusions to the righteous and the blessing that they will experience, and also this sort of idea of them inheriting the earth, is really clear new heavens and new earth language, which is similar to sections in Isaiah 65 and 66. And the parts that I read, it's not as clear, but if you read the later parts, sort of up to verse 9, you'll see a lot of repetition of new heaven and new earth language. And then also this idea of the wisdom that will bring the righteous through this period of tribulation and will save them in the final days, is this sort of recurring theme throughout the book of 1 Enoch of good wisdom that serves and saves the righteous. So we'll end our discussion on 1 Enoch 1:5 here. We've looked at the introductory text, we've looked at sort of the prophetic role of Enoch, and also a lot of the traditions surrounding his wisdom and his prophetic visions. And so I think that's a good segue when we leave it here into the Book of Watchers itself, the Book of Watchers proper, and we'll look at the idea of the angelic sin and the fall of the angels in the next section. So thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next video.